Welcome to our expansive world of storytelling. I truly don't understand why you're pausing at this intriguing door, where lengthy, whispering tales eagerly await you, with each word carefully crafted by my own hands. I have the ability to reveal to you a multitude of additional wonders that are yet to come. Clock? Ticked away like his measured life. The living room was warm, cozy with old furniture and a dusty smell. Holding my head, I listened intently. One year, we experienced a particularly frosty winter. By December, the ice had already reached a thickness of 15 centimeters, and there was almost no snow at all. The conditions were perfect for playing hockey. The gray-haired old man began telling his story, smoking a pipe and looking me directly in the eye. My friend Coley and I decided to head to the river. We put on our skates, moved in different directions, and began passing the puck to each other. Grandpa then coughed, leaned back in his old, creaky rocking chair, and continued the story in a slow, creeping voice. Kolya, with a powerful swing, you sent the puck flying. I didn't even realize how it slipped past me. I had to chase it up along the river. As I was gliding on the ice, everything beneath my feet was visible, like looking through a glass. Rocks, seaweed, and fish were all there. It was as if I was gazing into a book, reading the pages of its life story. I became so engrossed that I completely forgot about the puck. I was skating along, and suddenly I felt an electrifying shock of terror. Right under my feet, beneath the ice, a dead man, Viktor Stepanovich. He got caught on a snag with his sweatshirt and is just floating there. His skin has turned blue and his eyes are glassy. He looks up at me from the bottom with a completely blank stare. I screamed loudly and ran all the way home in my skates. The old man laughed heartily. Kolka could barely manage to catch up with me back then. It turns out that Stepanich had gotten drunk during a fishing trip and fell into an ice hole. The current dragged him beneath the ice. After finishing yet another horror story from his childhood, grandfather would usually pause for a long time, then noisily sip his tea from his mug and look somewhere through me, lost in his memories. And I, at that time still just a 12-year-old boy, sat across from him at the kitchen table, listening with my mouth open in sheer amazement. Whenever my parents went away, they always left me with my grandfather. This way I was taken care of, and he wasn't left feeling bored. His apartment was located in a building that was constructed on the site, where there once stood an old village. All of Grandpa's childhood unfolded in this village, a time brimming with adventures and fascinating stories. Then the dilapidated houses were demolished, and the residents were moved to cozy apartments. Recently, there were events that made me remember one more of his stories. Grandpa was sitting in his favorite rocking chair, drinking tea with rosehip and oregano. Looking at me with his kind eyes, already lightened by age, he offered me to listen to an interesting story from his childhood. I immediately, without a second's hesitation, agreed. When I was a teenager, just like you, there was no internet or computers available, so all our entertainment took place in the yard. In the village where I grew up, there were very few games available at all, and children had to entertain themselves as best they could. We had this fun activity called hanging a snitch. The old man placed a mug with some unfinished tea on the table and began to actively demonstrate the game process with gestures. We would take a small nut or a nail, tie it onto a thread, and hang it on someone's window so that when the wind blew, the nut on the thread would swing back and forth. Such a snitch never gave the adults a moment's peace, and we would watch as people in the late evening stood at their windows, puzzled, unable to figure out who was knocking. At times, you'd catch sight of such ridiculous expressions on their faces. It was absolutely hilarious. Grandpa would laugh, smiling at his own childish delight. I had a friend, a boy named Kolya. He was just a bit older than I was. That winter, he turned 14. During the winter in the village, you become so bored, it's as if you want to climb the walls. It gets dark quite early, so there's no time for playing or sledding. Therefore, we decided to have some fun with these snitches in the evenings. As the darkness settled in, we would quietly sneak up to a house, then carefully stick a button into the window frame on top, and tie a piece of string with a small weight to it. We would then move about 20 meters away and patiently wait. The key part here is that when the wind blows, the weight swings on the string and begins tapping on the window. Luckily, the wind was just perfect for this. Kolya and I had made sure to stock up on plenty of thread, buttons, and small nuts. We eagerly anticipated the fun as we arrived at Aunt Luba's house. We hung the weight and then waited patiently. Our little game turned out to be a great success. Aunt Luba peeked out of the window not once, but 3 times, and she stared into the darkness for quite a while, wrinkling her forehead in curiosity. Eventually, she couldn't resist any longer and stepped outside. She looked around carefully. There was no one in sight, and she couldn't spot us. We had hidden ourselves quite well amidst the fluffy fir trees close to her house. Once Aunt Luba went back inside, Kolya quietly went over and took off the nut. The elderly man had a coughing spell, covering his mouth with his hand, and then continued speaking. We went ahead to the house of grandfather Nikifor. He owned a rifle, and we placed a bet on a flick about whether Nikifor would come out with a rifle or without it. We were quite foolish, but we were young, and there was no one to teach us Murazom yet. Kolya said he'd come out without the gun, but I placed my bet on him having the gun. It was quite frightening, and that's where the thrill of the game lay. It was my turn to hang the weight, so I went, trying hard not to make any noise with my cotton pants. There was no light visible in my grandfather's windows. I assumed he had gone to bed early, perhaps because he planned to go hunting in the early morning hours. I quietly crept up to the window, pressed the button, and peered into the room to see if my grandfather would notice me there. The curtains were drawn open, allowing me to see the house quite well. There was no one visible in the front room, but I could clearly see that grandfather Nikifor was sitting by the table. A candle was gently burning on the table, and he was intently staring at some paper, reading it carefully. After tying a thread with a weight, I proceeded to Kolya's hiding place, and together we began our wait. We waited there for around 10 minutes. The wind was quite weak, and the load barely swayed. All of a sudden, we heard my mom calling me to come home. Since we couldn't wait any longer for my grandfather, we said goodbye to Kolya and rushed home, forgetting to remove the weight. He sighed deeply. He glanced around the room with sadness and quietly resumed the story, almost as if he was too embarrassed to continue. In the middle of the night, I was woken up by a loud rumble coming from the street, I think. Through my drowsiness, I didn't quite understand it. Then suddenly, there was another loud bang, as if it were a gunshot. I jumped up quickly and ran into the kitchen. My mother and father were already standing there, looking concerned. Father began to get dressed, saying, "I'll go. I'll check what's wrong." And then he left. My mother and I sat down at the table and waited anxiously for his return. Father came back, out of breath, and said that Nikifor had lost his mind. He was sitting in the street, barefoot, with a gun, looking mad, his eyes clouded, talking about his daughter, claiming she had died and come for him, and that he had been knocking on the window all night long. We brought him back home, sent for a doctor, worried that grandfather's heart wasn't strong enough to handle it. That night, I couldn't sleep at all, as my conscience was deeply troubled by the fact that Kolya and I had upset my grandfather so much with our jokes. The next morning, we found out that Nikifor had passed away. He suffered from a heart attack. In his house, on his desk, they discovered a letter from his ex-wife. The letter mentioned that his daughter had passed away. Suddenly, everything formed a horrifying picture in my mind. It turns out my grandfather was sitting there, reading this letter, while I was hanging a nut on his window. And following that, it seems the wind probably began, and a nut started tapping on his window. He imagined it was his deceased daughter knocking. I felt both ashamed and frightened simultaneously. The old man clasped his hands together and shut his eyes, experiencing everything once more, just like on that tragic day. The very first thing I did was rush over to Kolya. Upon reaching him, I discovered that he was already aware of everything and was also scared to mention the informer. We agreed not to share it with anyone. In the late afternoon, they untied the string from Grandfather Nikifor's window, and then it seemed as if they had completely forgotten about it. After my grandfather's funeral, we started experiencing sleepless nights. Both he and I began to hear knocking sounds on the window during the night. There were knocks sometimes, not like a heavy weight, but rather like a man tapping gently with his knuckle. It was so soft, it would make the hair on my neck stand on end. I would wrap myself tightly under a blanket, unable to breathe or sob. I was filled with terrible fear. One particular night, I was awakened by another knock. I gaze out the window. The moonlight is shining through the curtain, and I catch sight of a man's silhouette. But who could it possibly be? I was almost certain at that moment that it was Grandfather Nikifor. Of course, I couldn't verify it. I was too scared to pull back the curtain, yet I was also too frightened to get out of bed. After a minute, the silhouette vanished. As soon as morning came, I hurried to Kolya. I recounted the incident from the night before. I looked into his eyes and noticed that he didn't even blink. It was as if he had been concussed. Then Kolya turned to me and said, "My grandfather also visited me at night. Initially, I thought it was just a dream, so I wasn't very frightened. I got out of bed, walked to the window in the darkness, and there he was, standing outside the window, just waiting. I quickly pulled back the curtain, but there was no one there. Tears started flowing from Kolya's eyes, making them red. It seems the hysteria won't let him go. I embraced him tightly, holding him close, and the fear seemed to dissipate. On that particular day, the wake was held in the home of Grandfather Nikifor. It had been 9 days since he passed away. Kolya and I decided not to go. Instead, we all stayed at home, pondering how to move forward. Grandfather's spirit, we felt, would not leave us now. However, following the wake, we experienced 2 weeks of peaceful sleep. Nothing seemed to disturb us, and we began to believe that our nightmares had finally ended. Then one night, exactly 25 days after Grandfather's passing, I awoke from a particularly bad dream. He stood up, but his throat felt dry and it hurt when he breathed. I went to get a drink of water, and I hadn't yet wiped my eyes. I walked, stumbling over everything in my path. I barely managed to reach the water tank, drank some water, and then went back. By the time I returned to my room, I was already asleep. The window was open, and the wind was blowing the curtain, making it flutter. I stood there like a stump, wiped my eyes once more, and saw that the street was empty. After gathering all my strength, I ran to the window, quickly closed the shutter, locked it with the latch, and jumped into bed. I couldn't fall asleep, as various thoughts swirled in my mind. I gazed around the room, peering into the dark corners. Outside the window, the night was quite bright, and the curtains fluttered as the wind blew them open. Suddenly, a bird crashed into the window with a loud noise. It appeared to be a crow. In the villages, there were no windowsills, so it clung to the lower frame with its claws, its beak tapping against the glass. Then it flew upwards, pushing against the window, but it was locked. It perched on the open shutter and remained there. During all this time, it felt like I wasn't even breathing, as if my heart had stopped beating. Slowly and carefully standing up, I made my way to my parents' room. I sat down in a chair there, with my legs tucked up, and just sat there. My mom woke up and gasped in surprise. I explained to her that I was really scared of the raven that almost flew into my window, and she hugged me, kissed me on the top of my head, and took me back to my bed. Outside the window, the crow had disappeared. Mom pulled the curtains closed, and I wrapped myself up in a blanket. Not long after, he drifted off to sleep. Interrupting the moment, my grandfather inquired if I wished to continue the story the following day. Eagerly, I requested him to carry on with the story right away. The next day is one I remember quite vividly. I woke up late in the morning, and there was a lot of commotion. Everyone was rushing around the house in a frantic manner, looking disheveled. Aunt Nadia and Kalina's mother were both at home. As I walked into the kitchen, everyone gave me a strange look. It was clear they wanted to say something, but they couldn't bring themselves to do it. It turns out that Kolya had been found dead earlier that morning. He was lying in his bed, his mouth wide open, and his eye sockets were empty, with blood trickling down from them along his temples, soaking the pillow in blood. There are crow feathers scattered all over the room, and Nastusha's window is wide open. He must have had a visitor during the night. It seems he didn't get a chance to close the window. He must have been sound asleep. As for Kolya's death, nobody offered any explanations. Everyone was deeply shocked by the boy's tragic and terrible death. I stopped sleeping after that. However, I didn't experience any frightening visions. In the dim light, time just passed by until it was 40 days after the passing of grandfather Nikifor. On the 40th day, we held a wake, once again at my grandfather's house. I'm going. I was no longer afraid at all. I didn't care about anything anymore. When I remembered Kolya, tears flowed down my eyes. At the wake, Kolya's grandmother was there. I liked her very much. She was such a kind old lady. She came up to me, hugged me warmly, and pressed me to her. Her palm lay gently on my cheek, so warm and soft. I cried quietly. Kolya's grandmother mentioned that shortly before he died, Kolya had told her everything about our deed. She once again gazed deeply into my tearful eyes and said, "You should go to the chapel, light a candle at Grandpa Nikifor's funeral, and sincerely ask God for forgiveness." After the wake, I made my way to the chapel, lit a candle, and it felt as though a weight was lifted from my soul. That night I dreamt of Kolka. He appeared joyful and content. In the dream, we were happily sledding together. After that, I never experienced any more nightmares or troubling visions. Yet, those terrible nights remain unforgettable to me. That was the end of my grandpa's story. As he talked, I drank tea with jam. I only took one sip. The rest of the time, I listened with my mouth open. A light breeze passed through the kitchen. My arms and legs had goosebumps. The tea was cold, and I didn't know where to set it. Suddenly, I heard a clear knock on the window. I was sitting at the table, looking toward the window, with Grandpa's back turned to me. In the dark night outside the window, I thought I saw a silhouette pass by quickly. I jumped up suddenly and, pointing my finger at the window, shouted, "Look over there!" He turned around to see, but there was no one outside the window. I asked him if he had heard the knocking sound, but Grandpa hadn't heard a thing. He added, surprised, that it was unlikely anyone could knock on the window of an apartment situated on the 8th floor. My grandfather's hearing was bad at that time, so I didn't try to change his mind. But I clearly heard a knock and saw something pass in the darkness outside the window. 7 years have passed since that moment. The day is sunny and warm today, July in all its glory. My grandfather died today. He had a heart attack. Not surprising for his age. He was at the age where you take pills by the handful. All the family gathered at his apartment. The body was already gone. They took him to the morgue. People went around the rooms and shared their memories of the deceased relative. I stood in the kitchen, recalling our long evenings, his fascinating stories, and that dreadful tale from my grandfather's childhood. I approached the window and noticed a long thread near the window frame, with a small nut hanging on it.